Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.
For preaching LSD, high surrealism. After their expulsion from Harvard, Leary and Alpert were determined to carry out additional studies in the religious use of psychedelic drugs. They set up a grassroots nonprofit group called the International Federation for Internal Freedom, whose ranks quickly swelled to 3,000 dues-paying members. Local offices sprang up in Boston, New York, and Los Angeles. IFIF believed that everyone should be allowed to use mind-expanding chemicals because the internal freedom they provided was a personal, and not a governmental matter. They envisioned a society in which large numbers of people would seek higher consciousness, ecstasy, and enlightenment through hallucinogens. It's only a matter of time, Leary stated confidently, until the psychedelic experience will be accepted. We see ourselves as modest heroes, an educational tool to facilitate the development of new social forms. We're simply trying to get back to man's sense of nearness to himself and others, the sense of social reality which civilized man has lost. We're in step with the basic needs of the human race, and those who oppose us are far out. In the summer of 1963, IFIF moved its headquarters to a hotel in Zihuatanejo, Mexico, a lush tropical paradise 200 miles north of Acapulco. There they sponsored an experiment in transcendental living based on the utopian writings and visionary insights of Aldous Huxley. Leary invited Dr. Albert Herman to participate in a seminar on drug research at the hotel, emphasizing that broadcast and print journalists from the most important mass media would be present. Hoffman demurred. He was disturbed by Leary's publicity-conscious approach. Huxley declined an offer to join the fledgling movement on similar grounds. He was seriously ill at the time. On November 22nd, the same day President Kennedy was assassinated, Huxley passed away after receiving his last request, an intravenous injection of LSD-25 given by his wife. As she administered the psychedelic, Laura Huxley saw this immense expression of complete bliss and love. She whispered, "Light and free, let go. Darling, forward and up. You are going toward the light." During its short but spectacular career, the chemical utopia at Zihuatanejo was deluged with over 5,000 applicants, far more than IFIF could handle. The group's activities revolved around a tower on the beach in which at least one person at all times maintained a solemn vigil while high on LSD. The ritual changing of the guard took place at sunrise and sunset, and to be chosen for a stretch in the tower was considered a privilege. Beatnik and bohemian types were not allowed to participate in the program, but that did not stop them from pitching tents nearby. Smoking marijuana and lounging in the sun, these scruffy, uninvited guests did little to enhance IFIF's reputation, nor did rumors of the all-night orgies that were supposedly commonplace in the hotel. Scarcely 6 weeks after they had arrived, lurid reports in the Mexican press led to the expulsion of the LSD colonists. Leary and Alpert returned to the U.S. with their small but energetic band of followers and began to look for an alternative base of operations. During this period, they rubbed shoulders with some of the richest jet-setters on the eastern seaboard, including William Mellon Hitchcock, a tall, handsome stockbroker in his 20s. Hitchcock was the grandson of William Lorimer Hitchcock, founder of Gulf Oil, and a nephew of Pittsburgh financier Andrew Mellon, who served as Treasury Secretary during Prohibition, 81 thanks to a sizable inheritance and a family trust fund that provided him with $15,000 per week in spending money. Billy Hitchcock was in a position to offer a lot more than moral support to the psychedelic movement. He first turned on to LSD after his sister, Peggy, the director of IFIF's New York branch, introduced him to Leary. They hit it off immediately, and Hitchcock made his family's 4,000-acre estate in Dutchess County, New York, available to the psychedelic clan for a nominal $500 monthly rent. At the center of the estate sat a turreted 64-room mansion known as Millbrook, surrounded by polo fields, stables, beautiful pine forests, tennis courts, a lake, a large gatehouse, and a picturesque fountain. 2 hours from New York City by car, this idyllic spread served as the grand backdrop for the next phase of the chemical crusade. With a new headquarters at Millbrook, IFIF was disbanded and replaced by another organization, the Castalia Foundation, named after the intellectual colony in Hermann Hesse's The Glass Bead Game. Leary, a great fan of Hesse, felt that this particular book illuminated many of the problems he and his cohorts would confront while trying to apply the psychedelic experience to social living. Specifically, Leary was concerned about the relationship between the mystic community and the rest of society. He did not want Millbrook to degenerate into a haven for isolated intellectuals. His group would avoid this perennial pitfall by remaining socially relevant. They would undertake the spiritual search in a communal setting and report back to the rest of the world. They would keep records, compile statistics, and publish articles in their own journal, the Psychedelic Review. Above all, they would become an active, educative, and regenerative force, an example for others to follow. A core group of approximately 30 men and women gathered at Millbrook, including many acid veterans from the early days at Harvard. They were rejoined by Michael Halsted, who had left the group in early 1963 to work in New York City with an organization known as the Agora Scientific Trust. Halsted had quite a scene going for a while at his Fifth Avenue apartment. The entire place was laced with LSD. The food, the furnishings, etc., and anyone who came through the door inevitably wound up stoned. He threw some wild parties at which everybody was dosed. Those in attendance included people from the United Nations whom he knew from his days at the British Cultural Exchange. But when Halsted learned of Hitchcock's generous offer, he knew it was time to pack his bags and head upstate. That's where the action was, and he wanted to be part of it. 82 the Millbrook residents were a tight-knit group. They shared a common lifestyle geared toward exploring the realities of their own nervous systems in a creative rather than a clinical setting. Their goal was to discover and cultivate the divinity within each person. The permanent members of the household regularly tripped together, rotating as shaman and follow the leader sessions involving high doses of LSD-25. The elusive aim of these group sessions was to break through to the other side without losing the love and radiance of the acid high during the crucial re-entry period. Various methods were devised to facilitate a permanent spiritual transformation. Since many in the group had backgrounds in behavioral psychology, it came natural to them to keep a scorecard of their changing states of consciousness. On certain days, a bell would ring 4 times an hour starting at 9 a.m. The bell was a signal to stop and record what they were doing then, what game they were playing. They thought that by paying more attention to shifting motivations and interpersonal dynamics, they could learn to transcend their habitual routines. They compared scorecards and rapped endlessly about how LSD was affecting them. In many ways, the scene at Millbrook was like a fairy tale. The mansion itself was beautifully furnished with Persian carpets, crystal chandeliers, and a baronial fireplace, and all the rooms were full of elaborate psychedelic art. They were large aquariums with unusual fish, while other animals, dogs, cats, goats, wandered freely through the house. People stayed up all night tripping and prancing around the estate. Everyone was always either just coming down from a trip or planning to take one. Some dropped acid for 10 days straight, increasing the dosage and mixing in other drugs. Even the children and dogs were said to have taken LSD. Millbrook was a constant party, but one infused with a sense of purpose and optimism. The residents saw themselves as the vanguard of a psychic revolution that would transform the entire society. Victory seemed inevitable because they thought they had a means of producing guaranteed mystical insight. As Halsted described it, we lived out a myth which had not yet been integrated into our personalities. Millbrook was itself the work of art. Like Kafka's Castle, it gave out messages into the ether in the form of one high resonant sound which vibrated on the ears of the world, as if it were trying to penetrate beyond the barrier separating us from them. We felt satisfied that our goal was every man's, a project of every man's private ambition. We sought for that unitary state of divine harmony, an existence in which only the sense of wonder remains, and all fear gone. 83 Billy Hitchcock, the millionaire padrone, never really entered into the close camaraderie of the Millbrook circle. He lived a half-mile from the big house in his own private bungalow, a 4-bedroom gardener's cottage with a Japanese bath in the basement. There he carried on a social life befitting a scion of one of the country's wealthiest families. Hitchcock never totally broke with his old routines even though he had begun turning on. He still kept in close contact with his friends from New York and with various brokers and investors who visited his bungalow for private parties. Some of these people were introduced to LSD through Hitchcock, but it became a running joke at Millbrook that you should not turn on your lawyer, or anyone who had to take care of business for you, lest he drop his briefcase and head for the psychedelic sunset. Hitchcock would usually be on the phone all morning talking with Swiss and Bahamian bankers, setting up business meetings and fast money deals. By afternoon he had taken care of his monetary affairs and would occasionally join the scene at the mansion. Why Hitchcock decided to throw his weight behind the psychedelic cause is still something of a mystery. Was he simply a millionaire acid buff, a wayward son of the ruling class who dug Leary's trip? Or did he have something else up his sleeve? Mr. Billy, as his servants affectionately called him, claimed he got involved with LSD because kicking the establishment in the teeth was exciting. Of course, since Hitchcock was the establishment, some questioned what he was really up to. Michael Halshead, for one, never fully trusted him. Most residents, however, thought Hitchcock a charming fellow. As one insider commented, it hardly registered that he owned the place. He had a happy, open way of talking, perfect manners, a sort of Frank Merriweather type who had somehow fallen into a pool of gold and come up smelling like marijuana. Hitchcock got along well with Leary and often joined the acid fellowship and group trips. At times he became very emotional and vulnerable on LSD. One night he had to be reassured that he did indeed own the estate. But unlike the others, Mr. Billy tended not to verbalize his feelings. He never developed any metaphysical system about the LSD experience, which was rather peculiar since everyone at Millbrook was into some kind of half or full-cocked philosophy. Hitchcock's interest in LSD did not appear to be a simple matter of spiritual enrichment. He was not one to wax poetic over the prospect of merging with the oversoul. When asked at the outset of one group session what question he wanted answered by the acid trip, he replied, "How can I make more money on the stock market?" Timothy Leary, the eternal optimist, did not seem bothered by such rock-hard considerations. The early days at Millbrook were in many ways a felicitous time for him. He married a beautiful Swedish model named Nina Schlepberg in an open-air wedding on the grounds of the estate, with everyone decked out in Elizabethan attire. Tripped out on the surrealistic spectacle they had created, the guests passed through the reception line with gifts of cocaine, reefer, and psychedelics. For their honeymoon, Leary and his princess made a pilgrimage to India, where they tripped on acid at least once a week and smoked hash the rest of the time. During this meditative hiatus, Leary ruminated upon what lay ahead. He now conceived of himself as a neurologician, having discarded his academic career forever. He was convinced that it would be a psychedelic century. Tim laid out blueprints for man's next 500 years, surpassing even his own stoned hubris. When he returned to Millbrook a month and a half later, he shared his insights with the group. 84, although a legal crackdown was a subject few were willing to contemplate, some of the Millbrook residents had a clear premonition that they only had a few trouble-free years to play with this fantastic new energy. If so, they had to make the most of it. They experimented with drugs in a bold, innovative, sometimes reckless fashion, and the results were often surprising. One night, Richard Alpert retired early with a bad cold. Halshead and a friend named Arnie Hendon decided to fix him up. When they couldn't rouse him, they gave him a shot of DMT in the buttocks. Alpert sat bolt upright, and before the DMT wore off, they fed him an additional 800 mics of LSD in a spoon. 3 stereo systems were blasting Coltrane, Stockhausen, and Beethoven simultaneously. A sea of rocky sounds enveloped Alpert as he swirled through a neurological flux. When he came down from his trip, he found that his cold symptoms had completely disappeared. Richard Alpert had come a long way since the days when he was moving up the academic ladder at Harvard University. I had a lot of identities that I called Richard Alpert. I played the cello. I flew an airplane. I was charming. I was a Jewish boy making good in Boston. But he gave it all up for a new cause, which he embraced with the zeal of a true believer. His faith was such that he became convinced during an acid trip at Millbrook that he could actually fly. To test this hypothesis in the soundest empirical fashion, he jumped out a second-story window. Alpert broke his leg but endured the discomfort amiably. The experiment, he thought, had been a noble one. Millbrook was psychedelic central for the whole East Coast. Like a magnet, it attracted illustrious visitors from all walks of life. The doors were always open, and people were constantly coming and going. Among the musicians who passed through the estate were Maynard Ferguson, Steve Swallow, Charles Lloyd, and the irascible genius of the acoustic bass, Charles Mingus. Other guests included philosopher Alan Watts, psychiatrists Humphrey Osmond and R.D. Lane, cartoonist Saul Steinberg, and actress Viva Superstar, a prominent figure in Andy Warhol's avant-garde art circle in New York City during the mid-1960s at the Factory. As Warhol's aluminum foil-walled studio was called, people indulged in every drug they could get their hands on. Occasionally, members of Warhol's eyelash set dropped in on the ever-obliging Dr. Jake for a quick poke of euphoria. When he came to Millbrook, Dr. Jake added psychedelics to his speedball injections, much to everyone's immediate gratification. As it turned out, Dr. Max Feelgood Jacobson served as John F. Kennedy's personal physician during the Camelot presidency. He often administered vitamin injections that left JFK flushed and excited, leading some to speculate that the shots included methamphetamine or cocaine. Paul Krasner, editor of a satirical journal, the realist and a future founding father of the Yippies, also had a session at Millbrook. My LSD experience began with a solid hour of what my guide, Halshead, described as cosmic laughter. Krasner recalled, "The more I laughed, the more I tried to think of depressing things, specifically, the atrocities being committed in Vietnam, and the more wild my laughter became." He laughed so hard that he threw up. Krasner tried to put his first trip into perspective. "LSD was fun, but if I never take it again, I'll be happy. I enjoy coping with reality. Napalm is burning someone to death in Vietnam this very minute, but PM alive, and that's what I was really laughing at. 85 The oneness of tragedy and absurdity." The climactic message I got while high was, "It's very funny." One day a NASA scientist named Steve Groff turned up at Millbrook. Dr. Groff wanted to observe how Leary and his clan ran their sessions. They gave him some acid, and he in turn provided samples of a secret drug known only as JB-118, which the military had developed as an incapacitating agent. Similar to the Army's BZ, this potent superhallucinogen simulated a kind of free fall, at the same time triggering bizarre visions. A few of the Millbrook regulars tried the space drug, and Ralph Metzner described the results. Objects are seen that are not objectively there, and other objects that are present are not perceived. For example, one subject saw a man sitting on a chair in the middle of the room and talked with him. When the subject walked close, man and chair disappeared. All of the subjects reported and were observed walking into doors or furniture, which they had not seen. Sometimes the basis of the hallucinations was clear, e.g., a coat on a bed would be seen as a small dog. In other instances, no such transformation seemed to underlie the hallucination. For example, one subject saw a friend of his, the size of a 3-story building, crawling around the garden on his hands and knees, eating the tops of trees. Things were considerably less dramatic for the common folk and the curious who paid to attend weekend experimental workshops at Millbrook. These bi-monthly seminars were tongue-in-cheek affairs for the regular residents, but they were necessary in order to raise money for rent and living expenses. The idea was to offer people an opportunity to explore psychedelic-type realities by means of Buddhist meditation, yoga, encounter groups, and other non-chemical techniques. When the visitors arrived, a rule of silence was imposed so that the general vibe was not brought down by frivolous discussion, and to keep the food bill at a minimum, breakfast was turned into an experience in sensory association. Guests were told to think about how their tastes were color conditioned, after which they were served a meal of green scrambled eggs, purple oatmeal, and black milk. Few ate heartily. Meanwhile, hundreds of letters asking about LSD poured into Millbrook from those who couldn't make it in person. A 10-point scale was devised for replies, with 1 calling for a dull dear sir form letter and 10 meaning a totally way out response. The replies to Arthur Kleps, a virtual unknown who would soon make his presence felt at Millbrook, were consistently in the 8 and 9-point range. 86 in 1960, while still a graduate student in psychology, Kleps sent away to the Delta Chemical Company for 500 milligrams of mescaline sulfate. After swallowing the bitter powder, he spun through an unforgettable 10-hour journey. All night I alternated between eyes open terror and eyes closed astonishment. With eyelids shut I saw a succession of elaborate scenes which lasted a few seconds each before being replaced by the next in line. Extraterrestrial civilizations, jungles, organic computer interiors, animated cartoons, abstract light shows. For the next 4 years Kleps kept this experience more or less to himself, thinking about small things like sex, money, and politics. However, when he discovered that there was a group of intellectuals taking psychedelics on the grounds of a country estate, writing papers about trip realities, and having a great time, Kleps decided he was just being chicken. School psychology went out the window. It was high time to start catching up with the psychedelic pacesetters, and the only way to do that was to join them. Kleps did not fit into the scene so readily. The first time he took acid at Millbrook he wound up brandishing a gun, and Fallshead promptly threw him out of the house. Despite this initial faux pas, Kleps was later admitted as a resident of the Gatehouse. Phi was more of an epistemological hardliner than the others, who in his opinion wanted nothing better than to have unusual experiences and proclaimed them religiously significant. Kleps was straining to develop a metaphysical system that would encompass the far-reaching implications of psychedelics, brooding over such basic questions as what is mind, and what is the external world. His solipsistic excursions were frowned upon as nitpicking, strictly a downer. "You're on a bad trip, Art," said Leary, who scolded the newcomer for drinking too much and not grooving with a more cosmic perspective. In those days, a high dose of LSD was viewed as a solution for almost anything, and someone had the bright idea that it might solve the Kleps problem. One of his comrades, Kleps swore it was Flaul's head, placed a few thousand mics of pure Sandoz in a snifter of brandy beside his bedstand. Before he even rubbed the sleep out of his eyes, Kleps downed the brandy. A few minutes later he realized he was having trouble brushing his teeth. I was knocked to the floor as all normal sensation and motor control left my body. The sun, roaring like an avalanche, was headed straight for me, expanding like a bomb and filling my consciousness in less time than it takes to describe it. It swirled clockwise and made 2.5 turns before I lost all normal consciousness and passed out, right there on the floor. As he groveled on all fours, he got a shot of thorazine in the rear, but it failed to bring him down. He spent the last hours of the trip sitting in a bed in the lotus position. As Kleps told it, a big book appeared, suspended in space about 3 feet in front of him, the pages turning automatically, every letter illuminated in gold against sky-blue pages. It was only years later, when he read a description of the 2.5 turns that characterized the classic Kundalini experience, that he came to an understanding of what he went through the day he'd been bombed. As the parlance had it, none of the Nobrak priests would acknowledge that a release of Kundalini energy was what happened to Kleps. Maybe they thought he wasn't spiritually mature or pure enough to have had the big one. Kleps, however, thought himself sufficiently advanced on the spiritual path to found his own psychedelic religion, the Neo-American Boohoo Church. Formed in 1966, the Boohoos claimed that their use of LSD was sacramental, similar to the peyote rituals practiced by Indians of the Native American Church, and should therefore be protected under law. Not surprisingly, the Boohoos lost their case in court when the judge ruled that an organization with Row Your Boat as its theme song was not serious enough to qualify as a church. Apparently, Kleps concluded, those in control of the instrumentalities of coercive power in the United States had no difficulty in recognizing a psychedelic religion as a psychedelic religion when that religion was safely encapsulated in a racial minority group living outside the mainstream of American life. Kleps, whom Leary described as the mad monk and an ecclesiastical guerrilla, was particularly sensitive to the dangers of elevating institutional forms to the level of eternal verities, and so included elements of foolishness and buffoonery in his church. The church catechism is contained in his Boohoo Bible, full of cartoons, true or false tests, and a variety of hilarious liturgical observations on such topics as how to guide a session for maximum mind loss, and the bombardment and annihilation of the planet Saturn. Small monthly dues entitled members to a psychedelic coloring book as well as copies of the religious bulletin Divine Toad Sweat, emblazoned with the church motto, Victory over horse shit. Leary was a bit miffed. Art, this is not a psychedelic love message. It's a whiskey trip. But the chief Boohoo was adamant. It's my trip. Take it or leave it. Kleps sent diploma-like announcements to 500 people across America certifying that they were Boohoos. Billy Hitchcock became a Boohoo during the same period in which he was immersed in some questionable financial dealings with Resorts International, a Bahamian-based gambling consortium suspected of having ties to organized crime. Kleps was always on Hitchcock's case, trying to pump him for money or wheedle him out of it or steal it. This didn't seem to bother Hitchcock much. What the hell, he figured, at least Kleps was more interesting than most of the others. The psychedelic manual life at Nobrak had a mythic dimension that was nourished by a sense of having embarked upon a journey into unknown waters. Once they had eaten the apple of expanded consciousness, there was no going back. The umbilical cord that tied them to the world of the mundane was irretrievably sundered. Caught between a past that was no longer accessible and a future without precedent, they had only one option: to plunge headlong into the moment, to ride the crest of the wave that was still building, even if they could not see where it would take them. All they had was each other, their audacity and sense of humor, and plenty of LSD. Sooner or later, as everyone realized, the trip would have to come to an end. And what then? They celebrated their own transience by bathing in an atmosphere of hijinks and adventure. The incredible had become commonplace. Ecstasy merged with confusion. Dream and reality were interchangeable. Even though they became more familiar with the psychedelic terrain over the years, the profound sense of disorientation that characterized their first trips lingered to some degree among the Nobrak residents. LSD had opened the floodgates of the unconscious, both personal and collective, and all kinds of strange flora and fauna were emerging. They didn't know quite what to make of it. Some of it made sense, some of it didn't. Not enough time had elapsed for their insights to take root and mature. They tried to put their fingers on a definite truth, but there was nothing solid to grasp. It was all slippery, ambiguous, dialectical. Everything implied its opposite. Old meanings had been annihilated. New ones were yet to be articulated. In searching for a language to describe essentially non-verbal experiences, they kept running up against a built-in credibility gap. As Kleps put it, for every clarification that one arrives at by discussing these matters with others, there is a corresponding reinforcement of an illusion or misunderstanding. The only reliable way to get there is by closing one's eyes and jumping blindly into nowhere. It is only in such leaps, motivated by whatever passion, perversity, or dedication, that the adhesive grip of duality is escaped, and the way made clear for the unconditioned light. Despite all the changes they had undergone, Leary and his associates were still basically psychologists who felt compelled to figure it all out. But acid had overturned their dogmas and left them dangling precariously in an intellectual limbo that was reinforced by the hermetic environment of the Millbrook estate. As far as they were concerned, nothing less than the entire history of human thought had to be reconsidered in light of the psychedelic experience. Kleps parodied their dilemma in his Chronicle of the Millbrook Years, describing the arrival of LSD as the big crash in whose wake the intellectual history of mankind fluctuated madly on the cosmic exchange. Zen and Buddhist stock rose sharply while yoga, Brahmanist and Vedantist issues plummeted. In London, Blake enjoyed a mild rise, Hume skyrocketed, Aldous Huxley weakened, then held, and penny a share issues such as Aleister Crowley and Yeats disappeared entirely from view. In Paris, former glamour stocks like Sartre and Camus began to look a little green around the gills. Such superficially disparate stocks as Thoreau, Nabokov, Borges, and Norman Zero Brown were driven to undreamed-of levels. All the Zen masters spiraled into the blue. Freud and Jung went through wild gyrations resembling an aerial dogfight, before both sank gradually to earth. The I Ching went through the roof. The Gita crashed. Shakespeare, unlike almost every other stock being traded, remained absolutely stable. The sense of psychic displacement was felt most acutely by Timothy Leary. Even though years had passed since his first acid trip, he could still say, "I have never recovered from that shattering ontological confrontation. I have never been able to take myself, my mind, and the social world around me seriously." Now that he was aware of countless realities, routine existence had been revealed to him as illusory. But that did not make it any less problematic. He confided to Kleps that at times he had the uncanny sensation that his head was running down his shoulders, and that he had even considered having himself committed. Whenever Leary took LSD, he relived a recurring science fiction paranoia. Suddenly I am on camera in an ancient television show. All my life routine's a pathetic clown act. Leary particularly wanted to develop an organized framework for understanding the potentials released by psychedelic drugs. He set out to devise a manual or program that would serve as a guide for acid initiates on their jaunts through higher consciousness. Given that there were no extant myths or models in his own tradition, he looked to the only sources that dealt directly with such matters: the ancient books of the East. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Leary found a text that was incredibly specific about the sequence and nature of experiences encountered in the ecstatic state. With a little intellectual tinkering, the self-proclaimed priest-scholars Leary, Alpert, and Metzner produced an updated interpretation of the ancient scripture. They represented it not as a treatise for the dead, but as an instruction manual on how to confront the clear light of the void during the acid peak with a minimum of fear and confusion. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was first linked to the psychedelic experience by Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception. Huxley reported that at one point he felt himself on the verge of panic, terrified by the prospect of losing his ego. He compared his dread with that of the Tibetan dead man who could not face the clear light, preferring rebirth and the comforting darkness of selfhood. Huxley said that if you began to trip the wrong way, everything that happened would be proof of the conspiracy against you. It would all be self-validating. You couldn't draw a breath without knowing it was part of the plot. He thought that perhaps he could hold the terror at bay by fixing his attention on what the Tibetan Book of the Dead called the clear light. But only if there were somebody there to tell me about the clear light. One couldn't do it by oneself. That's the point, I suppose, of the Tibetan ritual: somebody sitting there all the time and telling you what's what. Leary took Huxley's remarks literally and turned the Tibetan Book of the Dead into a psychedelic manual. While Huxley had referred to it in an essay written after his psychedelic experience in order to clarify it, Leary promoted the book as a guide before and during the trip. This strategy represented a significant departure from the procedures employed by Dr. Humphrey Osmond and other psychedelic therapists of the previous decade who simply sought to help subjects relax and remain open to the experience without defining what was supposed to occur. Leary now presented turning on as a process of initiation into a great brotherhood of free souls christened by the mind-blowing apprehension of the clear light during the peak of an acid trip. While the Eastern vibes surrounding the acid sessions at Millbrook may have been benign, Leary's methodology was in some ways analogous to that of the CIA and the military, which also programmed trips, although with a very different objective. Eventually, Ralph Metzner and Michael Halshead were forced to admit that programming a trip was much more difficult than they had originally anticipated. LSD did not easily lend itself to step-by-step goal-oriented instructions, which more often than not created more confusion than they dispelled. There was a great deal of disagreement among seasoned acid veterans as to the real meaning of the vision of the clear light. Halls had experienced something akin to it but did not consider it the final nirvana. Let's face it, LSD is not the key to a new metaphysics of being or a politics of ecstasy. The pure light of an acid session is not this. It may even be the apotheosis of distractions, the ultimate and most dangerous temptation, but it does allow one to live at least for a time in the light of knowledge that every moment of time is a window into eternity, that the absolute is manifest in every appearance and relationship. The experience in which eternity takes root in the waking state is brief, yet its significance is profound. It may take months, years, even a lifetime to come to terms with this fleeting moment of vision. Any experience so overwhelming, so incomprehensible to normal waking consciousness, carries with it a tendency to rationalize it as quickly as possible. Art Kleps felt that the peak of a major death-rebirth experience was no time for making formulations. On the contrary, he insisted that one should fight this urge. If you can't let go and instead grab the first lifesaver or bit of wreckage that floats near your thrashing form, you will come down firmly believing that the lifesaver you grabbed was the meaning of the trip rather than the exit from it. Your new personality will be defined, not in terms of the truth, but in terms of the particular lie you happened to grab at the crucial moment. It would appear that Leary succumbed to this LSD temptation when he developed the notion that a person could tune into his genetic code while high on acid. Is it entirely inconceivable, he mused, that our cortical cells, or the machinery inside the cellular nucleus, remembers back along the unbroken chain of electrical transformations that connects every one of us back to that original thunderbolt in the Precambrian mud? Leary suggested that by taking LSD he could commune with the evolutionary program and actually make contact with the ultimate source of intelligence, DNA. He turned his cellular visions into a kind of psychedelic Darwinism, positing the reading of the individual genetic code as a universal truth. God does exist and is to me this energy process. The language of God is the DNA code. Kleps took issue with Leary's conception of a good trip. He insisted that people who never had mystical experiences on acid could learn just as much as those who did. He thought Leary placed too much emphasis on pleasurable visions. 9 times out often, talk about bad trips resolves itself into a naive identification of pleasurable visionary scenes and sensory appreciation of the present with goodness. When such people find themselves in a few hell worlds here and there, they think that something is seriously amiss. For Kleps, LSD was never supposed to be easier than traditional methods of self-realization. It was only faster and sneakier. According to the chief Boo, you could be devoured by demons during a psychedelic experience, and it still might be a good trip if you came out of it feeling that it was worthwhile. Kleps maintained that striving for a preconceived visionary end in the acid high only complicated things and led to bummers. It is as if deliberately, and with malice aforethought, polluted the stream at its source and gave half the kids in psychedelic society a bad set to start out with. Almost every acid head I talked to for years afterwards told me he had, as a novice, used the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a guide, and every one of them reported unnecessary anxiety, colossal bummers, disillusionment, and eventual frustration and exasperation, for which, in most cases, they blamed themselves, not Tim or the book. They were not pure enough, or perhaps the Lord of Death did not deign to transform them because they were not worthy of his attentions, etc., etc. The psychedelic biography of Allen Ginsberg illustrates the futility of the program trip, be it self-initiated or imposed from without. Ginsberg found that even self-programming could create formidable psychic tensions, often resulting in awful bummers. His desire for a heavenly illumination, which he sought through LSD, was a carryover from a powerful non-drug experience he had in 1948. Ginsberg was then living in a sublet apartment in Harlem. While reading William Blake's Sunflower, he heard a deep, resounding voice. He immediately recognized it as Blake's own voice emerging from the dead. Ginsberg felt his body afloat, suffused with brilliance. Everything he looked at appeared in a new light. He was struck by an overpowering conviction that he had been born to experience this universal spirit. When Ginsberg began using psychedelic drugs, his Blake vision was his reference point. As he put it, LSD gave access to what I, as a poet, have called previously aesthetic, poetic, transcendental, or mystical awareness, but he ran into trouble when he attempted to recapture the cosmic heights of his Blackian episode via drugs. He wanted to write a poem under the influence of LSD that would evoke a sense of divinity, but he found that the act of writing interrupted the multitudinous details inundating his nervous system. The tension between the romantic vision of illumination and the simultaneous urge to communicate it turned his divine quests into bum trips. Ginsberg described his frustration in numerous poems he composed while high on acid and other psychedelics. The reply, magic psalm, mescaline, and lysergic acid. Ginsberg had been painting himself into a corner with drugs, thinking that he should take acid to cleanse his soul and trying too hard to attain some sort of satori. He felt a compulsive obligation to use LSD again and again to break down his identity and conquer his obsession with mortality. His growing paranoia with regard to psychedelics came to a climax when he ingested Yage in Peru in 1960. Again, he was primed for divine revelation, but instead the whole fucking cosmos broke loose around me. I think the strongest and worst I've ever had it. I felt faced by death, felt nauseous, rushed out and began vomiting, all covered with snakes, like a snake seraph, colored serpents and aureole all around my body. I felt like a snake vomiting out the universe, or a Javero in headdress with fangs vomiting up in realization of the murder of the universe. My death to come, everyone's death to come, all unready, I unready. Toward the end of 1961, Ginsberg undertook a spiritual pilgrimage to India to come to terms with his unsettling drug visions. On the way, he stopped in Israel to talk with Martin Buber, the eminent Jewish philosopher, who emphasized human relationships and advised him not to get caught up in confrontation with a non-human universe. Ginsberg received a similar message in India from Swami Sivananda, who told him, "Your own heart is your guru." These encounters set the stage for a sudden realization that came to him a few months later, during the final days of his long journey. While riding a train in Japan in mid-1963, he had an ecstatic conversion experience, an inexplicable but deeply felt resolution of his trials with psychedelics. The relief was so great that he wept on the train. Inspired by this breakthrough, he pulled out a pencil and wrote a poem called The Change, Kyoto-Tokyo Express, which signaled a turning point in his spiritual search. Ginsberg had been seeking divinity throughout of the body trips on psychedelics. In trying to superimpose the acid high on his old memory of a cosmic vision, he was not living in the present. He was blocking himself. Now he saw the futility of attempting to conjure visions of a blissful imaginary universe when the secret lay within his own mortal flesh. In this moment of profound insight, he understood that truth could only be experienced within the framework of the body. Therefore, the overarching mystical imperative was to become one with his own skin. He was not so much renouncing drugs as refusing to be dominated by them or by the obligation to take psychological risks with chemicals to enlarge his consciousness. I spent about 15-20 years, Ginsberg reflected, trying to recreate the Blake experience in my head, and so wasted my time. It's just like somebody taking acid and wanting to have a God trip and straining to see God, and instead, naturally, seeing all sorts of diabolical machines coming up around him, seeing hells instead of heavens. So I did finally conclude that the bum trip on acid as well as the bum trip on normal consciousness came from attempting to grasp, desiring a preconceived end, a preconceived universe, rather than entering a universe not conceivable, not even born, not describable. Secure in his sense of self, his mind calm, Ginsberg had a different personal set for his subsequent LSD trips, which took on a whole new character for him. He began to enjoy himself while he was high. After all he had been through, Ginsberg finally realized that the experience of peaking on LSD is above all one of an open horizon, a field of presence in the widest sense. Any clutching at the eternal or the clear light or the hidden message of the DNA code necessarily became a fixation, an objectification, and therefore an inauthentic relationship to the infinite openness of psychedelic consciousness. Once Ginsberg was able to direct his attention outside himself, there were no heavy judgments required by acid, just an appreciation of the world that lay before him. The hard sell despite criticisms of trip programming, Leary still saw advantages in working with a manual. If a particular spiritual state could be consistently reproduced, there was a good chance the psychedelic movement would really take off. hence the adoption of the Tibetan Book of the Dead as the first LSD guidebook. Since the movement's only activism was the psychedelic session, the first step was to persuade people to take the drug. Leary aimed his message at those whose hearts and minds were still up for grabs. The younger generation. He saw himself as the orchestrator of a mass cultural phenomenon. His goal was to encourage large numbers of American youth to decondition themselves away from the work-duty ethic by means of psychedelic drugs. Leary insisted that the insane rat race was the real narcotic escape and that people could find a new kind of harmony by dropping out and sanitizing themselves with large helpings of LSD. He advised taking the drug repeatedly in order to transcend the mind's habitual fixations. Find the wisdom in yourself. Unhook the ambitions and the symbolic drives and the mental connections which keep you addicted and tied to the immediate tribal game. To those in the inner circle, it quickly became apparent that the psychedelic movement would be sold like beer, not champagne. As Kleps put it, whether or not the liberation was bogus, the style was strictly Madison Avenue. Leary not only hyped LSD as a shortcut to mystical enlightenment, but also fused it with something that had proven mass appeal: sex. In his 1966 Playboy interview, he discussed psychedelics in the broad social context of erotic politics and hedonic engineering. Acid was portrayed as a cure for homosexuality and a means of inhabiting a supremely sensual reality. In a carefully prepared, loving LSD session, Leary stated, "A woman will inevitably have several hundred orgasms. The three inevitable goals of the LSD session are to discover and make love with God, to discover and make love with yourself, and to discover and make love with a woman." That is what the LSD experience is all about. Merging, yielding, flowing, union, communion. It's all love-making. The sexual impact is, of course, the open but private secret about LSD. Leary had a knack for telling his audiences exactly what they wanted to hear. He could be all things to all people, whatever guise he chose. The gist of the message was essentially the same. It's all God's flesh. He insisted, LSD is always a sacrament. Whether you are a silly 13-year-old popping a sugar cube on your boyfriend's motorcycle, or a theatrical agent giving pot to a girl to get her horny, or even a psychiatrist giving LSD to an unsuspecting patient to do a scientific study, Leary's public pronouncements were calculated to seduce and frighten. He taunted his critics and prospective followers with brazen epigrams. You have to go out of your mind to use your head. As he saw it, Western culture had reached such a critical impasse that one couldn't afford not to experiment with LSD. Regardless of how dangerous such a venture might seem to the uninitiated, the potential benefits were simply too great to pass up. I would say that at present our society is so insane that even if the risks were 50-50 that if you took LSD you would be permanently insane, I still think that the risk is worth taking, as long as the person knows that that's the risk. Leary was a kind of carnival barker for the psychedelic movement. He had no compunctions about using the media to promote LSD. Tim had what we needed, said Kleps. He had the dreams of the true salesman. Leary was quite candid about his role as a media mogul. Of course I'm a charlatan. He often joked in public. Aren't we all? To Leary the PR was all pretense, a cosmic put on. That was what he had learned from LSD. All social roles were a game, and he could change personalities like so many different sets of clothing as the occasion warranted. His close friends never took him seriously as a guru or prophet or high priest. As Halshead commented, it was easier to see him as an inspired impresario, an Apollinaire or Cocteau. During the mid-1960s, Millbrook attracted considerable publicity. TV crews filmed regularly at the estate, bringing even more notoriety to Leary, who quickly became one of the most famous and controversial figures in America. Leary knew he could get more coverage by making provocative statements, and he played upon the public's infatuation with the sensational. He realized that the press was not an organ for disseminating truth. No matter what one said, it would always be distorted by straight journalists. Thus, even when the media castigated him as everything from an irresponsible egotist to a madman hooked on acid, he was not in the least flustered. On the contrary, such outbursts seemed to be grist for his mill. Any publicity was a walking stick, as far as Leary was concerned, and if it came down to choosing between no publicity and bad publicity, he would opt for the latter. Leary was confident that the subliminal message, LSD could take you to extraordinary places, would come through between the lines, and young people would turn on in greater and greater numbers. The Millbrook clan not only had their sights set on America, their aspirations were international in scope. In September 1965, Michael Halshead returned to his native London armed with hundreds of copies of the updated Book of the Dead and 5,000 doses of LSD. Halshead felt there was very little understanding of LSD in England, but he intended to change that. He proceeded to establish the World Psychedelic Center in the fashionable King's Road district of London, attracting the likes of Joe Burke, the writer and philosopher Alexander Trokai, multimedia artist Ian Somerville, filmmaker Roman Polanski, and numerous musicians including Donovan, Peter and Gordon, Eric Clapton, Paul McCartney, and the Rolling Stones. London was a swinging scene in the mid-1960s, and psychedelics were an intrinsic part of the cultural renaissance that revolved around the rock music explosion. Strangely enough, hardly anyone under 21 listened to the radio in England, as the BBC monopolized the airwaves with dance music and symphonies. To compensate for the lack of commercial channels, a group of go-getters organized a network of pirate radio stations that operated offshore beyond the 3-mile national limit but within transmitting distance of population centers all along the coast. The entire country was surrounded by small seacraft, and when they started beaming rock music, everyone bought transistors and tuned in. Halshead dug the setup. Every week he would emerge from his London apartment wearing his long coat, pink glasses, and wry smile, to be taken by motorboat to a floating pirate station near the Thames. He tripped with the DJs, rapped, played music, and laughed. There was no censorship of any kind. Needless to say, the British authorities were not amused. During this period, Halshead smoked pot and hash constantly, dropped acid 3 times a week in doses often exceeding 500 micrograms, and began using hard drugs. He obtained a doctor's prescription for methadone, and after working up to 7 injections a day, he found himself at the mercy of a non-miraculous addiction. His gargantuan appetite for drugs turned him into a near zombie. In this condition, he was hardly capable of keeping his own house in order, let alone leading a psychedelic revolution in Britain. All hell finally broke loose one night at a party thrown by Halshead and his whacked-out colleagues. They decided to offer punch with LSD and without, but someone went ahead and spiked the whole batch. Suddenly there were over 150 people at his pad stoned out of their minds, including a lot of unsuspecting folks. Among those who turned on accidentally were a couple of undercover policemen masquerading as hipsters. When reports of this gala event surfaced in the London press, Halshead suspected his number might be up. A few days later the bobbies came to his flat and arrested him for possession of less than an ounce of hash. Halshead showed up in court high on LSD, and who knows what else, and was sentenced to 21 months in wormwood scrubs. He managed to smuggle an ample supply of acid into prison, but it was not his custom to turn on other inmates. However, he made an exception in the case of George Blake, the convicted spy who penetrated the highest echelons of British intelligence and passed information to the Russian KGB. Blake was serving the 6th year of a 43-year sentence when he met Halshead. His interest was aroused as soon as he learned that Halshead had hung out with Leary, and they arranged one Sunday afternoon to take LSD behind bars. As the session progressed, Blake became noticeably tense and paranoid. He thought he had been given a truth serum, and he accused Halshead of being a Secret Service agent. The spy finally settled down and spent the last hours of his trip reflecting upon his future and whether he'd be able to stand many more years of incarceration. A few weeks later, Blake escaped by scaling the prison wall with a rope ladder. When last heard from, he was living in Moscow and working in the Cairo section of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. Halshead wasn't the only one in legal trouble. Leary had been busted in December 1965 after he and his daughter were caught transporting 3 ounces of pot across the Mexican border into Laredo, Texas. Leary was fined $30,000 in addition to receiving a maximum sentence of 30 years. While his lawyers appealed the verdict, Leary returned to Millbrook. But the political harassment continued. Relations between the acid commune and the affluent townsfolk of conservative Dutchess County were always a bit strained, to say the least. When the town bigwigs heard that some of the local teenagers were hanging around Millbrook, they pressured the sheriff to put an end to the shenanigans of Leary and company. At the time, the Dutchess County prosecutor was none other than G. Gordon Liddy, the future waterbugger whose arsenal of dirty tricks included LSD and other hallucinogens to neutralize political enemies of the Nixon administration. But these events were still a few years in the offing. As far as Liddy was concerned, Leary and his pernicious band of dope fiends epitomized the moral infection that was sweeping the land. He was eager to raid the Millbrook estate, where, as he put it, the panties were dropping as fast as the acid. He and a team of deputies staked out the mansion for months, waiting for the right moment to make an arrest that would stick. Early one morning in April 1966, they decided to act. Crouched behind the bushes with their binoculars, they noticed some kind of film being shown in the house. Splendid, thought Liddy, jockeying for a peek at what he hoped was a pornographic display. The prospect of exposing a citadel of smut as well as a den of dopers was fine by him. He must have been disappointed to find that the film only showed a waterfall. The deputies made their entry in classic no-knock fashion, kicking in the front door and charging up the main stairwell. They were greeted by Leary bouncing down the stairs in nothing but a shirt. A warrant was read aloud, and Leary was finally persuaded to put on a pair of pants. The search continued for 5 hours. A small amount of marijuana was found, but no other drugs. Leary accused the police of using Gestapo tactics and violating his constitutional rights. When the Supreme Court ruled that suspects must be informed of their legal rights at the time of arrest, the bust was thrown out of court. Leary had escaped on a technicality, but Liddy was still hot on the case. Roadblocks were set up around the estate, and anyone who wanted to visit had to submit to a lengthy, humiliating strip search. The state of siege grew more intense, until the commune was forced to disband in the spring of 1967. The golden age of anarchy at Millbrook had come to an end.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.